Chaos is spreading across Russia, and this time it is not coming from the battlefield, it is coming from within. As sanctions cripple the country's two biggest energy giants, Rosneft and Lukoil, and Ukraine's relentless attacks reduce vital refineries to ashes, something far stranger is emerging from the Kremlin. While citizens queue for hours at gas stations and the ruble sinks to new lows, Moscow's leaders are discussing a project that sounds like a fever dream, a $1 trillion tunnel from Russia to Alaska. The idea first surfaced in early October 2025, announced by Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special representative and head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. He spoke of a new age of Eurasian connectivity, of a monumental link between Asia and America. But behind the grand words lay a harsh truth. This was a regime on the verge of collapse, clinging to an illusion of greatness. Analysts from Reuters and DW described it as a fantasy born of desperation. Even as ordinary Russians struggle to afford bread, the Kremlin is talking about drilling beneath the icy depths of the Bering Strait. The concept is not entirely new. Engineers and dreamers have speculated about an undersea connection between Russia's Chukotka Peninsula and Alaska's Seward Peninsula since the days of the Tsars. The proposed distance, around 88 kilometers, would make it more than twice the size of the Channel Tunnel between Britain and France. But the region is one of the harshest on Earth, a frozen wasteland where temperatures drop below -50 degrees Celsius, where permafrost melts and shifts unpredictably, and where colossal ice sheets crush steel and concrete alike. To even begin such a project, thousands of tons of steel, millions of cubic meters of concrete, and tens of thousands of workers would have to be transported to one of the planet's most isolated regions. Roads and railways would need to be built across thousands of kilometers of wilderness. The cost of building just the tunnel has been estimated at between $30 and $50 billion. But when factoring in infrastructure to connect it to existing networks on both continents, the price skyrockets to hundreds of billions, possibly even $1 trillion. For a nation whose gross domestic product is shrinking under war pressure, such a figure borders on insanity. It's a distraction. Notes Defense News, a symbolic project to make Russians forget their empty shelves and empty tanks. Yet the timing of this announcement could not be more paradoxical. While refineries burn and 84% of the country faces fuel shortages, the Kremlin dares to speak of global mega-projects. The irony is biting. Russia, unable to lay a clean water pipeline from Rostov to Donetsk, just a few hundred kilometers away, now dreams of conquering the Arctic seabed. For 10 years, the people of Donetsk have suffered water shortages, but no solution ever materialized. And yet at this moment of internal collapse, Putin's aides propose a bridge of continents. Observers see this as a clear sign that the Kremlin has lost touch with reality. This is not an infrastructure plan, says one Moscow economist. It is a political sedative, a fairy tale to calm a restless population. Indeed, the project's unveiling coincides with rising voices of dissent across Russia's major cities. From Moscow to St. Petersburg, local officials and journalists are breaking their silence, warning that the country is sliding toward disaster. But could this bizarre tunnel be more than propaganda? Some insiders whisper that Trump, intrigued by the proposal, expressed curiosity about the idea during recent discussions. Could this be Putin's last attempt to signal strength, to prove Russia still dreams big, even as it falls apart? Or is it, as many fear, the delusion of a ruler detached from the world around him? As the Arctic winds howl over the Bering Strait, the question remains, is this the future Putin envisions, or the final hallucination of a collapsing empire? As the Kremlin boasted about connecting continents, Russia itself was falling apart. October 2025 marked a turning point. A wave of refinery explosions triggered by Ukrainian drone strikes plunged the nation into chaos. Reuters reported that 84% of Russian territory was suffering fuel shortages, a figure that symbolized more than scarcity. It revealed a nation bleeding from within. In Moscow, endless queues of cars stretched for blocks, their drivers clutching empty fuel cans. In Siberia, farmers abandoned machinery, unable to power their tractors or transport their harvests. Across the country, the illusion of stability was disintegrating. This was the moment Putin's government chose to present its grandest fantasy, a $1 trillion tunnel beneath the Bering Strait. To the outside world, it sounded absurd. To the Russian people, it felt insulting. While pensioners struggled to heat their homes and hospitals rationed electricity, the Kremlin spoke of an Arctic megastructure that could take 30 years to complete. According to Defense News, even the feasibility study alone would cost billions and require technologies Russia no longer possesses under international sanctions. The contrast between dream and reality was grotesque. Russia had failed to maintain the Kerch Bridge to Crimea, a structure Putin once called his proudest achievement, and now proposed something 10 times more complex. The Bering Strait, nearly 90 kilometers wide, lies between two continents separated by tectonic fault lines and constant seismic activity. Temperatures fall so low that steel becomes brittle. The ground beneath remains frozen most of the year, then melts unpredictably during summer, causing landslides and fissures. Building anything there is not engineering, it is defiance of nature itself. Yet the real problem was not physical, but psychological. For decades, the Kremlin's power rested on two pillars: control and illusion. With the economy collapsing and the war in Ukraine draining resources, illusion had become the last surviving tool. State television presented the Alaska Tunnel as a visionary project for a peaceful future, framing it as a new Silk Road that would make Russia indispensable to global trade. But inside the country, reality could not be hidden. Supermarket shelves stood half empty, medicines disappeared from pharmacies, gasoline once cheap and abundant became a symbol of despair. In cities like Yekaterinburg and Novosibirsk, ordinary Russians began to speak out. Journalists once loyal to the regime dared to question Putin's decisions. Dmitry Shechin, editor of Komsomolskaya Pravda, a newspaper that had praised the invasion of Ukraine, publicly warned that continuing on this path means collapse. His words echoed across Russian social media, a space the Kremlin has struggled to silence completely. Local council members in St. Petersburg and Moscow soon followed, demanding Putin's resignation. It was unthinkable a few years ago. Now it had become a movement. Analysts at the Journal of Democracy revealed a shift few expected. 57% of Russians now supported peace negotiations, while only 35% wanted the war to continue. The message was clear: Russians no longer believed in victory. They wanted survival. As one protester in St. Petersburg said, "We don't need Alaska. We need bread." And yet the Kremlin seemed deaf. Every new announcement from Moscow grew more disconnected from the daily suffering of its people. Inflation soared, public services collapsed, and Gazprom, once the jewel of Russian industry, teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. International analysts called it a slow-motion collapse, where a state continues to function outwardly but rots internally. The image of a tunnel between Russia and America was supposed to inspire hope. Instead, it became a metaphor for Putin's isolation, a bridge between fantasy and despair. Every meter of imaginary steel symbolized the growing distance between the Kremlin and its citizens. But while the leadership dreamed under the Arctic ice, the real fire was spreading elsewhere across the oil fields, refineries, and power stations that once fueled Russia's empire. The next wave of Ukrainian strikes would push the crisis into its most dangerous phase yet. As the Kremlin's tunnel fantasy dominated headlines, the ground beneath Russia was literally burning. In mid-October 2025, a new wave of Ukrainian drone attacks ignited the most destructive fires the country had seen since the Second World War. One of the first targets was the Orenburg gas processing complex, one of the largest facilities of its kind in the world, crucial not only to Russia's domestic energy grid, but also to exports feeding Central Asia. The drones struck with surgical precision, turning the sprawling plant into a sea of flames, visible from dozens of kilometers away. The inferno raged for hours, consuming a key section of the SYU pipeline that carried gas to Kazakhstan. The consequences were immediate. Kazakhstan dependent on Russian supplies for its industries, and homes abruptly suspended purchases, forcing it to seek emergency agreements with China. Analysts from Al Jazeera and Reuters reported that the attack not only crippled Gazprom's already battered finances, but also deepened Russia's geopolitical isolation. For the first time, an ally openly turned away from Moscow for energy. Almost simultaneously, another swarm of Ukrainian drones hit the Novokuybishevsk oil refinery in the Samara region, a facility feeding the central Russian economy and supplying frontline forces. Within minutes, explosions tore through fuel storage tanks, sending pillars of smoke into the sky. The refinery's loss was catastrophic. The attack disrupted logistics chains linking Moscow to the Volga region and the Western Front, cutting off critical supplies of diesel and aviation fuel. Experts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted that Ukraine had evolved from tactical strikes to strategic warfare. By targeting refineries and gas facilities deep inside Russian territory, Kyiv had discovered a lever far more powerful than battlefield victories: economic paralysis. Drones costing a few $1,000s were dismantling infrastructure worth billions. This is asymmetric warfare at its finest, one analyst said. Each drone not only destroys steel and concrete, but chips away at Russia's image of invulnerability. Inside the country, the effects were devastating. 84% of the Federation's territory was now grappling with fuel shortages. Gas stations rationed supplies, selling only a few litres per customer. Fights broke out in queues. Police were deployed to control desperate crowds. Buses stopped running in small towns while hospitals struggled to power generators. As winter approached, the threat was no longer political, it was existential. In some northern regions, families began burning furniture to stay warm. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's response was silence. State media downplayed the attacks, airing old footage of full gas stations and cheerful commentators praising future mega-projects. But no one was fooled. The contrast between propaganda and reality became unbearable. Citizens recorded the chaos on their phones: dark highways, empty fuel pumps, children shivering in unheated schools, and uploaded them online despite censorship. The videos spread like wildfire, fueling anger that even the regime's propaganda machine could not extinguish. Independent economists warned that Russia's GDP was collapsing faster than official statistics admitted. The collapse of fuel distribution paralyzed agriculture, logistics, and manufacturing. Supermarkets ran out of essentials within days. A single missing tanker of diesel could now halt production lines or leave entire regions without food delivery. Yet in the midst of this chaos, the Kremlin continued to promote the Alaska Tunnel project as a vision of global leadership. It was surreal, a country that could not deliver gasoline to its own capital, promising to link continents with a futuristic tunnel. "It's Nero playing music while Rome burns," remarked one European diplomat. Except this time the fire is real and it's visible from space. As Russia burned, the illusion of control melted with the snow. Each new explosion, each new line of citizens waiting for fuel pushed the country closer to the edge. But the next revelations from inside St. Petersburg would turn this economic collapse into a political earthquake, one that would directly challenge Vladimir Putin's grip on power. While flames consumed Russia's fuel supply, a quieter, more dangerous fire was spreading in its political heart. It began in St. Petersburg, the city where Vladimir Putin's career had first taken shape decades ago. In mid-October 2025, the Smolninskoye District Council, a modest local assembly, crossed a line no one in modern Russia had dared to cross before. Its members filed an official petition to the State Duma accusing Putin of treason and demanding his removal from office. To call it bold would be an understatement. It was an act of political suicide. Under the Kremlin's laws, even hinting at disloyalty to the president could lead to imprisonment or worse. Yet these council members crafted their case with precision, citing the very constitution and legal codes that the regime itself had used to justify its rule. Their argument was devastatingly simple. Putin's decisions had destroyed the army, caused a demographic catastrophe, bankrupted the economy, and led to a strategic defeat on the world stage. The petition electrified social media and rippled through other regions. Suddenly, dissent was no longer whispered, it was written in legal language and signed by elected officials. Within days, several other councils in Moscow and major cities expressed support. It was the first visible crack in a wall that had seemed indestructible for 2 decades. Even journalists from state media began hinting at leadership fatigue. The once untouchable aura of the Kremlin was beginning to crumble. According to BBC News and Deutsche Welle, the Smolninskoye Declaration marked a turning point, not because it would be accepted by the Duma, but because it proved the regime was no longer feared the way it once was. As economic collapse deepened, fear lost its grip. Citizens who had spent years avoiding politics were now openly discussing Putin's resignation in cafes and workplaces. The taboo had been broken, Outside of politics, daily life was growing unbearable. Inflation devoured salaries, shelves emptied faster than they could be restocked, and pensioners queued in freezing weather for bread. Russia's elderly, the generation that had endured wars, famines, and revolutions, now faced humiliation once again. Many recalled the disastrous pension reform of 2018, when the retirement age was raised to 65 for men and 60 for women. Now those same citizens watch their savings evaporate as prices for food and heating tripled. "We survived everything," one babushka told a reporter, "but we won't survive this government." Meanwhile, soldiers at the front complained of fuel shortages, faulty equipment, and empty rations. Morale collapsed as reports surfaced of unpaid wages and commanders abandoning posts. Inside Russia, whispers grew louder that even parts of the military leadership were questioning the president's competence. The very institutions that had upheld his power began to crack under the weight of the war's failures. Independent polling data revealed what state television tried to hide: 57% of Russians now favored peace talks, while only 35% supported continuing the war. For the Kremlin, this was an unthinkable reversal. The patriotic unity that had once sustained the special military operation was disintegrating. The more the government insisted on victory, the clearer its defeat became in the eyes of ordinary people. In this atmosphere of despair, the Alaska Tunnel project took on a surreal symbolism. It was not a plan for progress, but a monument to denial, a promise of escape for an elite preparing for collapse. "Perhaps the tunnel isn't meant for trade," one analyst at the Times suggested dryly. "Perhaps it's meant for evacuation." The joke spread quickly online, shared by thousands who used dark humor as their only form of protest. In St. Petersburg, the birthplace of Putin's power rebellion had begun not with weapons, but with signatures and sarcasm. The echo of that defiance could no longer be silenced. The next blow, however, would not come from politicians or citizens. It would come from the frozen earth itself, as Russia's neglected infrastructure began to fail in ways no propaganda could conceal. As rebellions simmered in the cities, another disaster was unfolding far from Moscow, deep within the frozen landscapes of Siberia and the Russian Far East. The country's neglected infrastructure, battered by sanctions and starved of investment, began to fail piece by piece. In the midst of the Kremlin's talk of $1 trillion tunnel, bridges were collapsing, power lines were freezing, and villages were sinking into melting permafrost. Scientists from Reuters and DW described the scene as a slow implosion of a superpower. Permafrost, once the solid foundation of Siberia's vast expanse, was now thawing at an alarming rate. Entire highways cracked open, buildings tilted and sank. In Yakutsk, a city built on what was once frozen earth apartment blocks leaned like drunken giants. Oil and gas pipelines ruptured, spilling thousands of tons of crude into rivers that feed the Arctic Ocean. The Kremlin blamed the weather, but the truth was systemic neglect, years of corruption, underfunding, and propaganda that replaced engineering with illusion. Against this backdrop, the promise of drilling 100 kilometers beneath the Bering Strait sounded not just unrealistic, but grotesque. Russia could not even maintain its own water pipelines, yet it boasted of linking continents. In Donetsk, a city occupied for a decade, residents still lined up for hours to fill buckets with muddy water because the promised pipelines from Rostov had never been completed. Children there grew up learning to ration every drop, while the Kremlin dreamed of connecting Asia to America. For many Russians, this contrast was unbearable. The regime's detachment had become the nation's greatest enemy. "We are running out of water, fuel, and medicine, but they are digging to Alaska," one teacher from Novosibirsk told Al Jazeera. Her words echoed the growing sentiment that Putin's Russia was no longer a state, but a theater, a spectacle designed to distract from decay. Meanwhile, Ukraine's drone campaign continued to devastate what remained of Russia's industrial core. New strikes targeted storage depots in Tatarstan and Kursk, cutting off supplies that once powered factories and armored divisions. Satellite images published by Defense News revealed darkened cities and silent industrial zones stretching across the Urals. Power plants operated at half capacity, and blackouts became daily reality. The Kremlin's energy empire, once its pride, was now collapsing under invisible wings of Ukrainian drones, costing a fraction of a missile. Inside Russia, despair turned to anger. Protests erupted in isolated regions where people faced the winter without heating oil. Even small-town mayors began to issue open letters, pleading for federal help. "We are freezing," one letter read. "We have no fuel, no transport, and no future." For the first time, state television hesitated to show live footage from the provinces. The fear of revealing truth outweighed the fear of Western sanctions. Still, the Kremlin continued its grand narrative. Spokesmen promised that the Alaska Tunnel would revive Russia's status as a global bridge between East and West. Yet even that rhetoric sounded hollow. Relations with the United States had sunk lower than during the Cold War. No American administration would ever agree to collaborate on such a project. The tunnel's supposed partner lay on enemy soil. Western analysts began calling the idea Putin's mirage. BBC News likened it to the Soviet obsession with utopian mega-projects that drained resources and ended in ruins. For a leadership that once prided itself on pragmatism, this was a sign of terminal delusion. When empires fall, one historian commented, they stop building armies and start building fantasies. By late October, Russia's reality was clear. 84% of its territory faced fuel shortages, refineries smoldered, and people waited in gas lines that stretched for miles. Yet the only thing expanding was the gap between the Kremlin's dreams and the nation's survival. The stage was set for the final unraveling, the moment when denial could no longer hold back the truth, and even Putin's closest circle would be forced to confront the collapse they had created. By the final week of October 2025, the illusion could no longer be sustained. Russia's crisis had crossed from economic into existential. The nation that once claimed to challenge NATO was now paralyzed by shortages of food, fuel, and faith. Putin's government, trapped within its own propaganda, clung desperately to the fantasy of the Alaska Tunnel as proof of power, but even the most loyal citizens no longer believed. The grand project had become a symbol of everything that was broken, a bridge to nowhere, a monument to delusion. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was suffocating. Advisors flattered the president, feeding him selective reports that painted a distorted reality. They spoke of future glory, of rebuilding the empire, while outside the empire was disintegrating. Economists warned that inflation was spiraling beyond control. Power plants were offline, entire provinces were out of fuel, and Russian industry, once a pillar of global energy, was grinding to a halt. Even in Moscow, rolling blackouts plunged neighborhoods into darkness. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens were losing patience. Video after video appeared online, pensioners standing in endless lines for gasoline soldiers, begging for winter uniforms, mothers crying over empty shelves. The Kremlin tried to censor them, but it was too late. The silence had already been broken. The people no longer fear the truth, wrote Novaya Gazeta. They only fear the winter. The real Russia, the one beyond the walls of the Kremlin, was dying of exhaustion. Hospitals lacked medicine. Schools closed because they could not be heated. Farmers slaughtered livestock they could no longer feed. The collapse of fuel supply meant the collapse of everything: agriculture, transport, and even basic sanitation. The state that once claimed to conquer Ukraine could no longer keep its own lights on. And still the regime continued to dream. In grand televised speeches, Putin's ministers described the tunnel project as a symbol of Russia's unbreakable will, but to millions of viewers it sounded like mockery. Commentators on Deutsche Welle compared the spectacle to the legend of Emperor Nero playing the lyre while Rome burned. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, this time under the Northern Lights. Across Russia, a new phrase began to spread quietly among citizens and soldiers alike: the war is lost and the future is gone. It was not shouted in the streets, but whispered at dinner tables, written in private messages, and murmured in barracks. Each whisper carried the weight of 2 decades of unfulfilled promises. The question was no longer if the regime would fall, but how. Would it collapse in a single dramatic moment, a revolution like 1917, or rot slowly from within until only the shell remained? Analysts from the Journal of Democracy called it a slow-motion implosion, a process where a state continues to exist on paper but ceases to function in practice. The military was exhausted, the economy crippled, and the leadership isolated in its own echo chamber. As the Arctic winds howled over the empty gas stations and silent factories, one truth became undeniable: Russia's greatest enemy was no longer Ukraine or the West. It was the void between the Kremlin's fantasy and the people's reality. The Alaska Tunnel would never be built, but its myth would outlive the men who dreamed it. It would remain a symbol of a superpower's final delusion, carved in ice and forgotten beneath the snow. Russia's story has reached a breaking point. What began as a dream of strength has turned into a portrait of decline, a nation buried under its own illusions. The image of $1 trillion tunnel to Alaska will be remembered not as a vision of progress, but as the desperate mirage of a government detached from the world it rules. As winter closes in, millions of Russians are left facing the consequences of this deception. Fuel shortages, collapsing infrastructure, and a growing rebellion of voices demanding truth, all signs of a country standing on the edge. The question haunting the Kremlin tonight is no longer about tunnels or bridges. It is about survival. How long can a state ignore its people before it begins to collapse from within? Every empire reaches a moment when power and denial collide. For Russia, that moment is now. The war has drained its strength, and the dream of Alaska has exposed the hollowness of its leadership. What lies ahead may not be an explosion, but a slow, cold, unraveling one that no propaganda can conceal. What do you think? Is this the final chapter of Putin's Russia? Or will the regime find one last way to survive the winter? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the world's turning points.